Welcome back. You are into the part 3 of our Ministry of Spiritology's freestyle YouTube channel presentation concerning the recent Lent and Easter period. We had given this topic the segment entitled Happy Easter Equinox Mythology specifically. That's right. We were giving everyone a very happy Easter, of course. You know, the Ministry of Spiritology is a naturalist ministry, a cultural awareness mechanism which looks at the science of religion, essentially. When we're talking about spiritology, we're looking at the spiritual logic of human consciousness and how we have a relationship to universal consciousness, and what are the universal symbols which we find in religion that do recognize this expression of human culture and thought and behavior. And we find it even in this expression of Easter, which is something that is duplicated not only in the Christian tradition, which is simply just borrowed, an ancient pageant from specifically the Anglo-Saxon tradition, actually. But we know that Easter, Ishtar, Isis, or Osir specifically, Osset actually. We're going to get into all of that to let you really get the details of which culture we're talking about when we're giving which particular name. But I'm just trying to make you understand that Easter is something that traces itself back into antiquity, as our ancestors had always observed the sun, moon, and stars, and then created we should say created actually, because we created a calendar system to monitor it. But we didn't create the procession itself. It's something that is natural, it's already there. And that's something that's very important when we want to get into this whole idea of understanding Easter, because in the mythologies, a lot of individuals are led after believing the personified entities or icons or symbols which are put over the natural phenomena like Easter. I mean, people think that our ancestors actually worshipped a goddess called Ishtar or Easter, but in all reality, they recognized that it was an archetype that was symbolic of the life force of the earth, which was unifying with the plants and causing the regeneration of the crops, such that they knew they had a planting season. And that's why you see Easter was actually so important in the ancient cultures, because actually it is a festival that marks the natural cycle new year of the planet, the gestation cycle of the earth. Is actually what Easter does represent. And in specifically a lot of the Norse tribes and clans, they specifically set their Easter with the equinox. If it was March 20th or 21st or 23rd, that specific cosmic event was what they segmented and set their Easter to be now. But when the Christian church now came along trying to Christianize everything as they claimed, I mean, it wasn't even necessary, because you want to instead take a pagan rite, as you call it, something, and then you change the name of it and claim that it's good because you just changed the name of it. I don't want to even get into all of that, but essentially they took the Norse tradition of Easter and then decided that they would set it to be on the first full moon following the equinox annually, and they would use that first Sunday that would come after that first full moon every equinox session, and then they would know how they would have their Easter. So specifically this year, Easter was on April 4th specifically, with the equinox being on March 20th, and then they set Lent to commence specifically from, I think it was March 17th or something like that, January, February, March 17th, you see it. So that's how we were able to set up the year. We're gonna get into start looking at all this, not March, pardon me, let me correct that. February 17th, you see it. February 17th. We have to always get these dates real precise. We do our facts in spiritology because we can't joke with the work that we have to do for you, my people. So we've already started the discourse, essentially. Let me just go ahead and give you the introduction. If you don't know me, I am the naturalist minister in Kanwe Fokwambe, that is right, the Nkatla of Bafut, the initiator of the Ministry of Spiritology, and of course the director of the Association of Cultural Awareness. And this is our Ministry of Spiritology's YouTube channel. You are into the Ministry of Spiritology's freestyle lectures, essentially, and these are just 15 segment clips that we do in which we drop knowledge essentially. We give you basically the teachings and information that foundate our ministry to encourage our participants and members and individuals in the general public. If you're interested in actually, becoming a participant of our ministry, affiliating a lot with our virtual online work, which is what, the whole pandemic has created this opportunity for us to, raise up from being underground since 2007 with our cultural awareness activities and promoting of, cultural exchanges between Muslims and Christians back in Cameroon and other works on radios and television interviews. Now we're over in Accra, Ghana, still pushing this vision of what we're talking about as, naturalist revival, which promotes the idea of bringing back the African spiritual systems with a revision of their tenets and rituals, essentially, preserving, of course, the philosophy, which is the most important aspect of them, and the theory, and giving it a purified practice, which brings out the reality of the naturalist science which is in it. That's what spiritology is about, and we want to bring that essence out into all forms of naturalist traditions from indigenous peoples on the earth, from the pre-Christian traditions that were usurped. So we're doing work, of course, with the Druids, Celtic traditions, Gothic traditions, the Norse traditions, like you hear me already talking about, the Native American traditions that have also been working with the lobby specifically. We have Brother Steve Newcomb in the United States promoted a lobby towards the Roman Catholic Church to get a repeal of the Dum Diversas and Doctrine of Discovery. We're also going to be talking about that in subsequent broadcasts and doing promotion and putting a petition out actually to that state, because when we're talking about revision and revival of the naturalist traditions, we have to go back to the church and call them to acknowledge the error that they made. Whether they're going to acknowledge it or not is the point, but we do have to make that statement that the African naturalist traditions and spiritual systems are going to revise themselves in the context of the interfaith concepts which they have brought, to say that all religions on the planet, all spiritual traditions are equal. So with that being the case, it means that when they went out in the 15th century to come to African shrines, indigenous shrines in the Native Americans, even the work that they did throughout Europe, and the whole concept of promoting the right to desecrate indigenous tribes and clans, because you use the term pagan as a reference to create the idea of a heathen ideology, essentially, that your cosmology, you consider it to be inferior to our own. They use that as a premise now under what was called the Doctrine of Discovery, Manifest Destiny, essentially, to invade foreign lands. And invading foreign lands, essentially, they went there now to establish economic systems which in their countries would have been illegal. Until today, of course, it's been proliferated on the basis that there are papal bulls and documents which formed the basis of legal documents then when there were monarchies. We didn't have the UN like it is today, that are still enforcing a lot of protocols. So I know I'm deviating and talking about that, but like I said, we're really laying the foundation with this discussion and discourse, as we did point out. This is the new year starting, my people. So this information you're getting is very important. Always we're mixing it together. So you should see the orientation and understand why it's so important you get this explanation and teaching about the precession of the equinox and the solstices. You see it, because it is a new year. It is a new dawn. It is a new day here on the African continent with the work that we're doing and the networks that we are establishing very subtly and quietly. Truthfully, it is a bad boys move in silence and violence. You feel me? So, I've got out the clipboard today because we have a lot of information to go through. I know I've already digressed a lot, but we're going to try and really stay on topic and get through all of this so that you can really focus your mind now, because we use the Kemetic tradition as a foundational, symbolic teaching, because it is one of the oldest cultures that when you use it, its symbols can be used to interpret the subsequent spiritual traditions that came after it. You see it. So the Kemetic tradition is very important in spiritology. We don't say that we advocate that people convert to the Kemetic tradition. No. Though me as a minister, I do represent its symbolisms, like you'll see me wear, of course, an ankh. An ankh is a very ancient symbol, and it symbolizes the immortality conceived in the union of man and woman coming together to form the infant child. Now, of course, you see it. That's another concept I don't want to digress into. But you see that when we talk of archetypes and symbols and ancient symbols that have been manifest through varying cultures, the ankh being the oldest form of what is essentially become the Christian cross today. If you want to just look at it like that, though the ankh itself is not a cross, it's a symbol. But the Christian symbol being a cross, another symbol, it's a variation of an ankh. But I don't want to digress into all of that. We're looking specifically at the ankh and all of this relationship to Egypt and the Lent and Easter that recently passed. And also with the cross being one of the most ancient symbols, the Easter finds its most ancient representation actually in the Kemetic tradition. Now there's Sumerian traditions as well, like we talked about the weeping of Tammuz. I could talk about also Dumuzi and Inanna and all of that, but I don't want to go into all of that. We want to just be systematic with this information. And to be systematic, we're going to have to first talk about the Wepet Repat. You see it? Because the Wepet Repat was kept in Kemet around mid-July, which was when they actually had their New Year festival. You see it? Their New Year wasn't actually coinciding with the March 21st equinox or the April 4th, sequencing of waiting for the full moon to occur and then finding the Sunday. You see it. The ancient Kemetai, our ancestors actually kept the calendar system, which was very resemblant of the Islamic calendar system of today. You see it, because though people in the Greco-Roman tradition try to say that the ancient Kemetai calendar was purely a solar calendar, that's not true, actually. It actually had to take in value and consideration of the lunar rotation of the moon and its 28-day to maybe 33-day cycles. You see it. So we have a lunar solar calendar actually, and this coincides very closely with the way that the Islamic tradition has preserved its own keeping of its calendar and system today. And it's quite interesting actually that as we're finding now that this year, March 20th, marked the vernal equinox, and then Easter coincided specifically with, was it April 4th, right? Ramadan then came in 10 days later and fell on April 13th. Now, in the ancient Kemetic tradition, I mean, we're going back at least 2,000 years ago, you see, typically their Easter, or what would have been their Osset, you see it, that recognition of the sun coming in the east and the proximity of the earth moving from its December position to its March position, you see in the elliptic orbit. Always remember that when the Earth's moving from December to March, the elliptic orbit in distance is further. So as the Earth is coming from December position to March, it's increasing in intensity and heat. That's why we get now back into a planting season. So it's moving, and it's all associated with the sun. So they would call it something that had a title or reference to the east, as the earth is turning on its axis. You see, this is also a counterclockwise rotation. So as it's turning and the dark side of the earth is moving again into where the sun is, it gives us the impression on the planet that the sun is rising in the east. You see it, but all of this is happening celestial outside of the earth. So we have to be able to take our concepts now astrally in spiritology, beyond just being human souls that move upon the earth, but getting into the celestial movements and concepts. Every day as we wake up, we realize that the sun is not just rising, but all of these movements and changes in the universe are going. It's important to keep this in your mind in central focus, because the ancestors did it and devised now this whole system of mythology where they would recognize specifically in the Kemetic tradition that around mid-July that the Sirius A star would appear in the crescent moon, or what they called Sopdet would appear in the crescent moon. And then some few weeks later, the Nile River would flood. There would be an inundation. And then when they would have this inundation, they would know that their planting season had also started. And this is typical of how we also see in the Islamic tradition. They also do have adherence to Sopdet, or the Sirius A star, appearing in the crescent moon to declare the Ramadan month specifically. And this is really interesting, because when our ancestors, the ancient Kemetai, would see Sopdet, they would also declare now the month that commences the Wepet Renpat Festival. And this Wepet Renpat Festival, this is very important that y'all really get this knowledge now, because I had to put the clipboard, all the notes, and everything together to really get this and explain this to you all, right? The Wepet Renpat Festival, right, is actually the origins of what they call Easter today, right? By even language etymology. I'm going to break this word Easter down to you all. So you all really got to get your notes. You see it. When we were celebrating it, we kept it as what would be the Auxerre resurrection myth. You see it. Because we used personified symbols or iconography of natural phenomena that was occurring to create now a story that would now embody this logic of the movement of the earth and the changing of the seasons upon it, so that we could communicate it now to a child, or actually preserve certain knowledge about all of this that assisted us maintain our agrarian cycle, because, you know, it was agrarian culture, and that was the sustenance of humanity. Like we pointed out in some of our prior videos, humanity had three main things that we're supposed to be doing to survive. We need to have our shelter, we need to eat, and of course we need clothing. When we've got those three, everything becoming the arts and the rest of that starts to evolve. But in this context, you see it, this knowledge had to evolve from us having to eat, because you have to have a period on the planet when you can't plant crops and you have to store now up your food. So you have to anticipate this period of a dry season in the southern hemisphere, or it's going to be called the winter period or winter season inside the northern hemispheres of the earth. So you have to see that both hemispheres are going to be preparing for this period of the proximity of the earth, when it's going to be furthest away from the sun in its rotation of its orbit. And as you were going to prepare to stock this food, right, we would give it now a connotation of it being a dark period, of it being a period of death. You see it because you can't plant food. There's nothing growing. Of course, you're going to see there's a lot of sickness. In some areas, there's going to be famine. So the ancients considered that as a period of misery and death. And that's why you see that you would always see a lot of darkness associated with the concept now of the end of the year period and its festivals. But then you would see a lot of pomp and vigor and happiness associated with the whole July, March period and all of that. So the archetypes that they would assign to those various periods would also carry those symbolic themes in their representations and the metaphors about them, right? So when we're talking about the Wepet Renpat, you see we're talking about the Auxerre, Auset, Heru, and Seti mythology. And it's really important that I break this down for you all, because this is going to be your very first mythology that you're going to actually get from our freestyle lectures, right? And what you need to understand is this, right? I don't want to necessarily go so far back into the whole creation, because that's going to be an entirely separate lecture and discourse on its own. But in the Kemetai tradition, right, we had some senior archetypes, what the British people and the Europeans or the Greco-Romans came and started calling gods. And I mean, I'm going to have to really do a segment on our ancestors did not worship gods, G-O-D-S, because we've already explained in a prior recording that the word God is actually a proper name, Godan, for the Odin, a supreme deity. I mean, like I said, I don't want to, my brain's stopping, because I don't want to start digressing into all of that. But you start realizing that actually when we're going now by spiritology, by spiritual logic, that's why I say it's important you all start picking up these keywords and references. You say by spiritology, by spiritual logic, you see it, understanding, all of these terms, when they start to code your vocabulary, your consciousness starts to shift, because like we said, it's an ideological mechanism. That's what spiritology is. So it's an ideological mechanism of the association of cultural awareness. Spiritology is an ideological mechanism that when you learn how to use it, it's going to reshape your subconscious way of thinking to open up your soul so that it starts to develop on its own without necessarily needing input from individuals externally to you. You start to actually function the way that you are supposed to as an individual, that you can interpret the nature symbols. You can actually interpret your relationship in harmony with nature. That means that you actually can listen and walk with God again, because God originally was nature personified. But along the way, the traditions have lost that fact, and now they actually worship the symbols as idols.